nice of Nader to host this intimate gathering. I also want to thank Rabbi Osran for a beautiful singing of the national anthem. There is extraordinary diversity here tonight, and it demonstrates what I've discovered in my travels around the world, the vibrancy of the Iranian diaspora. I'm very pleased to bring greetings from Secretary Pompeo, who came to California last year to meet with the Iranian diaspora at the Ronald Reagan Library in Simi Valley. This happens to be my first trip to California as the U.S. Special Representative for Iran. And I am honored to be with members of the Iranian American community, people who share a great love for Iran and a great love for America. I've been told by many that this synagogue is the best place to begin my trip this week. And I know that many members of this community came here 40 years ago, after the revolutionaries hijacked Iran, with nothing but their shirt on their back. And today you embody everything that is great about America and the American dream. All of you here tonight have a deeply personal connection to Iran. You may have chosen to immigrate to the United States many years ago in search of a better life. Or you may have fled Iran to escape political or religious persecution. I know from speaking often with members of the diaspora that your connections to Iran and its rich history are a source of great pride. I also know that your past can be a constant reminder of how much Iran has changed since the revolution. In many cases, it can be a painful reminder. Before the Islamic Revolution in 1979, Iran was a vibrant nation and its trajectory was looking up. It had boundless potential. Many of you know this to be true from your own personal experiences, having lived there. Many more of you likely have heard the stories from your parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles who did. Iran was home to many languages and to many faiths, people who coexisted as brothers. Ideas and culture flourished, much as you would expect in the birthplace of some of the world's greatest artists, authors, scientists, philosophers, and political leaders. This legacy, which is authentically Persian and rooted in centuries of history, can never be erased or denied. It continues to live and thrive in communities right here and in so many places around the world. And you are very right to be proud of it. As hard as this kleptocratic regime has tried to make Iran in its own image, it has failed and it will continue to fail. After 40 years of the Ayatollah's repression and violence, the Iranian people's pride in their history has not diminished, nor has their resolve to celebrate it in the face of the Islamic Republic's abuses. This is why Iranians around the world continue to celebrate Nowruz, name their children after great figures from the Shahnameh, and pay homage to the tomb of Cyrus the Great. President Trump and Secretary Pompeo recognize that Iran's potential can be just as great as its past. But the Iranian people must be given the chance they deserve to flourish once again in their own country, as they have in diaspora communities like this one around the world. One thing that I've concluded is that Iranians are thriving all over the world except in Iran. Our Maximum Pressure campaign is aimed at bringing about this change in the Iranian regime's behavior. The Islamic Republic is a revolutionary cause. It is a movement that undermines and attacks nations directly and indirectly. Its foreign policy is the single greatest threat to regional peace. In Yemen, Iran has helped create a humanitarian catastrophe by backing the Houthis. Its support has done nothing but prolong and intensify human suffering. The Iranian regime has no legitimate interests in Yemen. As recently as December, a U.S. warship interdicted a significant hoard of weapons and missile parts, evidently of Iranian origin and destined for Yemen. While claiming it is committed to peace, Iran continues to fuel Yemen's conflict. In Syria, Iran supported Assad's brutal war machine as it killed hundreds of thousands of people and displaced millions in the worst refugee crisis since World War II. Under the cover of the Syrian war, the IRGC is now trying to plant military roots in Syria and establish a new strategic base to threaten Israel. Good luck. In Lebanon, the Iranian regime's goal of using Hezbollah to provoke conflict with its neighbors threatens the safety of the Lebanese people. IRGC backing has enabled Hezbollah to use murder, terrorism, and corruption to intimidate other Lebanese parties and communities. In Iraq, the regime continues to support extremist militia groups that target American personnel and interests. Recent orders given by General Soleimani dramatically escalated Iran's campaign of violence and terrorism against Americans and American interests in the Middle East. General Soleimani approved and directed a series of attacks against American forces in Iraq in the past several months, which culminated in rocket attacks on December 27th, killing 1 American, wounding 4 American service members, and threatening the lives of many more American personnel. As the world has now seen, President Trump took decisive action to defend American lives and prevent further bloodshed. President Trump took this action after repeated warnings, both publicly and privately, to the Iranian regime to stop targeting U.S. persons and interests. We had clear indications, based on our intelligence, of further imminent attacks under General Soleimani's command. As President Trump said, today we can remember and honor the victims of General Soleimani's many atrocities and take comfort in knowing that his reign of terror is over. Returning to Lebanon and Iraq, people there are pushing back against Iran's domination. The Lebanese and Iraqi people are crossing sectarian divides to assert their sovereignty and to reject Iran's malign influence. Protesters have taken to the streets in unprecedented ways to demand their countries back, free from Iranian domination. They have seen Tehran tyrannize the Iranian people, and they want none of it for themselves. Iran's revolutionary expansionist foreign policy is simply at odds with the values of nations around the world. Nowhere in the region are peace and prosperity compatible with this regime's influence and support. This administration has made it clear that such policies will no longer be tolerated. This regime must stop acting like a revolutionary cause and begin to live within its own borders, respect the rights of its own people, and behave like a normal nation. Our pressure campaign is designed to drive Iran to the negotiating table while at the same time denying it the revenue it needs to continue its destabilizing activities. Our sanctions are reducing the revenue streams that Iran's clerics rely on to incite sectarian violence, as well as fuel the suffering of its people and those around the region. When the president reimposed sanctions, the commentariat said that by acting alone, the United States could not and would not bring enough pressure to bear on Iran's economy, on the regime's economic interests. They also said our sanctions would cause protests against the United States and predicted that the Iranian people would rally around the flag and the regime. These so-called experts just don't understand Iran. The sanctions we have imposed on the regime are the toughest in history. They are making an enormous difference, and the Iranian people are rightly blaming their own government for 40 years of corruption, bloodshed, mismanagement, and theft. The Iranian people know who has stolen their wealth and has made Iran a pariah state. The mullahs have plundered the Iranian people for their own personal gain, as many of you here personally understand. This is why tens of thousands recently took to the streets in November to hold their leaders accountable and demand change. In response, the government murdered up to 1,500 Iranians, injured thousands, and jailed more than 8,000 innocent Iranians protesting basic human rights. The massacres were swift and brutal, which is why the regime turned off the internet. This regime responded with such violence because it is in a state of panicked aggression. Sanctions on its oil export have pushed exports to all-time lows. Oil exports are down by more than 2 million barrels per day, reducing Iran's revenue from oil by more than 80%. This amounts to a loss of at least $30 billion annually, with a total loss likely exceeding $50 billion since the sanctions were reimposed in May of 2018 when the president left the failed Iran nuclear deal. This decline is having a profound impact on the regime's ability to continue business as usual. This year, Iran's economy will likely shrink by at least 9.5%, and that is according to the IMF. This would be the steepest single-year decline in more than 30 years. Some analysts have projected an even steeper contraction, possibly as high as 12 to 14% negative GDP. This would put the Iranian economy on the verge of a depression. Historically low exports are also putting unprecedented pressure on the regime's budget. Oil export revenues typically comprise at least 30% of Iran's revenues. Our sanctions are bringing this figure for the first time closer to zero. Iran has tried to respond to budget shortfalls by cutting spending and resorting to stopgap measures to raise revenue. It's interesting that the regime never bothers to tax the IRGC-dominated companies, but shifts the tax onto the back of the working class people of Iran. The regime had to raid its sovereign wealth fund. It had to issue even more domestic debt. It attempted to privatize additional state assets, and it slashed subsidies. Its financial desperation recently forced the government to raise gasoline prices in an effort to save money and to increase revenue. As the protests in November demonstrated, it will be difficult for the regime to implement subsidy cuts without sparking even greater unrest and frustration among Iranians, who are sick of bearing the brunt of this regime's corrupt self-dealing. The supreme leader has recently promised, quote, blood vengeance. But the protests in November must have revealed to the supreme leader that his people have had enough of threats and foreign adventures. The failure of the regime to represent the will of the Iranian people is an enormous weakness that the supreme leader now faces as he weighs his response options. In short, the Iranian people have been demanding for a long time that the regime stop investing in foreign wars and sectarian violence and terrorism abroad and start spending that money at home, where it belongs, on the Iranian people. So look, our pressure campaign is going to continue until we secure a comprehensive agreement. This must include the nuclear issue, but it also needs to include Iran's role in the region, its missile development, its support for terrorism, its brutalization of its own people, and hostage-taking. Since Iran's clerics seized power in 1979, the world has accepted a certain level of Iranian violence in the region and around the world. The world tempered its expectations, narrowed the scope of its demands, and ultimately played by the regime's rules. Here's the problem. When you play under house rules, the house always wins. Playing by Iran's rules and not holding them accountable has only fueled the regime's expansion across the region. I hear this repeatedly from countries in the Middle East, from leaders in the Middle East as I travel around the region. The Trump administration will not play by Iran's rules. They will not play by the regime's rules. We are saying enough to this regime's activities, and we are holding it accountable for behavior that the world has tolerated for far too long. Last year, we took the historic and unprecedented step of designating the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a foreign terrorist organization, because it is. The designation highlights the plain fact that Iran not only supports terrorism through its proxies and militias, but also engages as a government in terrorism. The IRGC has institutionalized terrorism. As you can imagine, this is a regime that has gotten used to not being told no. But the only way to make the Middle East safer is to speak in a language this regime understands. And President Trump understands the language that this regime speaks. The Trump administration has rejected the defeatist mentality that has creeped into the world's approach to Iran and is restoring basic demands. Among these demands, we want Iran to end its support to terrorist groups and to reject Islamist extremism. We want the regime to use diplomacy to meaningfully address and resolve conflicts and not send out a fake foreign minister to tell lies. We want the regime to respect the sovereignty of all nations, friend or foe. We want the regime to spend less time scheming on how to undermine its international obligations and more time figuring out how to live up to them. We want the regime to stop enrichment and to never pursue plutonium reprocessing. This includes closing its heavy water reactor. The Iran nuclear deal should never have allowed the Iranian regime to enrich uranium at any level. We also want the regime to treat the Iranian people with respect and dignity and to uphold their rights as human beings. It's not too much to ask. This includes Iranian people of all faiths, including Iran's historic Jewish community, which is proudly represented here today. In Iran today, the regime continues to employ anti-Semitic rhetoric in official statements and sanction it in media outlets, publications, and books. Iranian officials continue to question the history of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism remains a pervasive problem. In November, President Rouhani called Israel a cancerous tumor and a fake regime. Many of you here know all too well the painful scourge of anti-Semitism in Iran. Secretary Pompeo recently took action to redesignate Iran as a country of particular concern under the International Religious Freedom Act. The world should know that Iran is among the worst violators of basic fundamental religious freedoms, and the United States will continue to hold it accountable. As Secretary Pompeo has said, we will oppose anti-Semitism unequivocally, and we will fight it relentlessly whenever it arises. We condemn the recent vandalism of Nassau Synagogue and stand shoulder to shoulder with the Iranian American Jewish community here and around the world. Tomorrow, I will visit Nassau Synagogue to meet with its board and learn more about its history and express this administration's solidarity in person. I want to conclude by pointing out that Iran's aggression over the last several months makes clear that it does not want to respect the basic demands of the Iranian people. It does not want to be told, stop abusing the rights of your people, or end your support for terrorist proxies. To the administration's peaceful to peaceful diplomatic and economic pressure, Iran has responded only with violence and terrorism. But this only means that we're doing the right thing. And we will continue down this path until the regime starts to make better decisions. Iran, as I said earlier, has conditioned nations to accept a regular level of violence and lawlessness out of fear of something worse. However, America's silence cannot be bought, and we will not be extorted into accepting Iran's violence and repression any longer. The world is tired of living in fear of Iranian aggression. Countries in the region certainly are. This is why Israelis, Arabs, and Persians across the political spectrum have come together, thanks to Iran's foreign policy, in historic fashion to demand the world to hold the regime accountable. These nations are tired of the violence, and they're tired of the world believing Iran's lies. Our efforts are aimed at addressing these concerns so that we can advance the cause of peace, and so that the Iranian people can flourish once again in their own country. And that's where you, the people of this audience, come in. I have a message from Secretary Pompeo. This administration is leaning in. The Iranian people are leaning in. We need you to lean in and let the regime and the world hear your voice. Genesis 18 tells us that our common father Abraham sat in the front of the tent in the heat of the day. He did not sit in the back of the tent in the comfort of the shade. We all must speak the truth together and do everything in our power to hold the regime accountable, not only for the Iranian people, but for the cause of peace for generations to come. Thank you.